Me he manurere ahaue kuarere kito moenga ki te awhitoti nana aue aue e te tautahuri mai. Aue aue e te tautahuri mai. Tēnei te mihi kia koutou i tēnei wā. Te tīmata tuatahi mo te karakia. Ka ino e tātou. I tuku tēnei wā kia koe ai o matua kore. Nawa no e homai ngā momo ringa ringa i a mātou i tēnei wā. He wā, hei tikinga ngā kupu, ngā kōrero, kia mirimiri, kia whakamāhana, kia tuku i ngā kupu, ki ngā tangata, hei oranga te kaupapa. Hei mahi rongoa tēnā. I nei kupu, he kupu iti noiho, engari ko te korowai manaaki, hei manaaki tēnei kaupapa. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e. Now that particular karakia I spoke about the well-being and the kaupapa that we have. It's a really important kaupapa. And so I used our kaupapa, that the outcomes of this kaupapa, the intention that it is the well-being for everyone. So he mihi nui kia koutou o tēnei wā. I tuku tēnei kōrero ki taku hoa, ko Sue Watson.
Kia ora. Mauri ora. I te kai karakia me te kai mihi tēnā koe kia koe maikara he kai manaki mō tēnei rōpū whānau. So maikara rōpata is kai manaki for my business, Connected Leadership, and we are so privileged to have her walking alongside us as tangata tiriti on our journey in leadership. I'd also like to acknowledge Chair Chris Swarbrick here today of the Helen Clark Foundation, and also Anna Stook, the founder of the Clare Foundation, and many other rangatira in this room. I do want to bring apologies for Helen Clark today, and at the last minute Helen was unable to join us, and so we send our aroha and our manaaki to her and her whānau at this time. I know she'd be the first one to say the kaupapa is bigger than any one person, so she'll be really thrilled that we are still gathering here today and honouring her mahi and her legacy. And she might even watch the video, so we are recording today. And also I want to acknowledge Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, welcome all of you who have made it here in person today. Wonderful to have a full house, as we often do for these events, but we have about 250 people joining us online from around the motu. They can't talk, sorry people, but they can see and hear us, I'm sure. And it may even be some people from offshore as well, I'm not sure. After the event, we'll be sharing all the links and the report and everything, so you can relax and just really tune into the kōrero today. So, ko Sue Watson tōku ingoa, I'm the founder of Connected Leadership, which is a community of about 1,000, mostly women, leading and shaping the future of Aotearoa across public sector, private sector and for-purpose sector. So that's, you see many women in the room. And to our tāne who've come today, kia ora, no mai haere mai. This issue that we are addressing today is not a women's issue. It's an issue for all of us. And as Maikara and I were preparing and having a kōrero about this event last night, we were remembering that actually the words that came to mind for me were tātou tātou. It's not something that's over there, it's here, present to all of us. And as the research has shown, 1 in 4 people in Aotearoa are impacted by sexual violence. So that's many of us in this room. And as I have been meeting our guests this morning, many of you who work directly with victims of sexual violence, family violence, other forms of violence in Aotearoa. So I just bring that awareness that this is a trauma-informed space, and acknowledging that there are many complex histories that and experiences that we are bringing into the room. So let's be gentle with one another and acknowledge that there's a lot going on for all of us as we lean into this kaupapa. I also want to acknowledge today Alberts. Alberts are extraordinary. They are our hosts today. And if you have a chance afterwards to wander about, it's the most beautiful co-working space, office space, and it's really shaping the future of how we work together in Midtown. This is a new precinct. If you didn't know it, you are in Midtown. You know, we'll have a High Line soon, won't we? That'd be cool. And so when I say to Alberts, because it's where I work and where I run my community of practice in Tamaki Makaurau, but we're also expanding into Wellington, I always say to the team at Alberts, this is something you'd like to support, and they're always like, yes. So just really acknowledge that. Thank you for bringing us together and enabling us to have this amazing kōrero today. So just how I do need to talk about health and safety. I always forget that. But those of you who need wharepaku, just outside the door at the back and turn to the left, and obviously you do that anytime you need to. Our emergency exits are one behind the run to the banner, and you will be safe. And also at the exit there, and apparently we're near Federal Street. I get very disorientated inside buildings with no windows. Go down into Federal Street and we assemble outside the Ridges Hotel. We're obviously hoping that we won't need to do that today. How we're going to roll is we've got about an hour for the formal kōrero, and we always leave a good hour because we know you like to talk to each other. And as we've already witnessed at the beginning of the event, and we've got plenty of time for that, so we'll be hosting you afterwards from 12 to 1. We'll be here for drinks and kai to follow this really important kōrero. I'm going to introduce two of our, what are they? VIPs, I guess, our rangatira to you, and then I'm going to hand over to the Helen Clark Foundation team to introduce the researchers who have undertaken this work. And so I don't need to talk a lot about it, which is great because they will be doing that. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, the Honourable Anne Tolley, who's the project ambassador for this important mahi. And I was reading up about, because you're such a household name for my generation in Aotearoa, but 20 years at Tairāwhiti as an MP. And then I was reading all your ministerial portfolios, and I thought every one of them actually intersects, and that's probably why one of the reasons you're project ambassador. So you've held the portfolios of Minister of Corrections, Minister of Police, Minister of Social Development, Minister of Education, and Minister for Women. So unfortunately, again, this take intersects with every one of those, and I know you would have seen it from many different angles, and the research is really powerful in showing that we need a systemic, whole of systems approach in terms of addressing sexual violence in Aotearoa. So thank you for being here, Anne. And then I'd also like to introduce Ruth Money, who is our Chief Victims Advisor. No mai haere mai, Ruth. And again, reading your bio was interesting because unusually, Ruth was, well, not unusually, fabulously, Ruth was a volunteer advocate for victims and a victims advisor for 13 years. And then they went, you can have the paid job as Chief Victims Advisor, an independent advisor to government. So regardless of what regime we are under, what stripe or spot, you are there to advocate for victims. And so kia ora and welcome. So I'm handing over to you now, Anne. Thank you so much.
Ina mana, ina reo e te iwi o te motu, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Anne Tolley, good morning everyone. As you've heard, I'm the project ambassador. I was never quite sure what that actually meant, but it meant that I could dip in and out and give advice, which was received, I have to say, very, very welcome, with great welcome and often ignored. And often taken notice of, but it was 50-50. So look, in fairness, I have been very privileged to be the project ambassador for the Helen Clark Foundation report addressing sexual violence in New Zealand. Can I acknowledge, Sue? It's great for the organisation to be partnering with you in delivering this report today. And thank you, Makari, for your welcome. Can I acknowledge Ruth again? Yes, so Chief Victims Advisor to the Minister of Justice, who's currently the Honourable Paul Goldsmith at the moment. And can I also acknowledge, as is the protocol, two parliamentary colleagues who are here with us, Jan Logie, I haven't seen Jan, she's somewhere here, oh, there we are, and Carol Beaumont, whom I did see when she came in. Can I start by thanking the Clare Foundation? And I'm told that they tend to sit at the back of the room and keep a low profile. Anna Stuck, who's the founder and chair, and Alice Montague, whom I did meet briefly, the CEO, and of course Jan Logie is their strategic funding lead. Good research costs good money. But if you want to affect change, you've got to have good research. So it is fantastic and it's critical to have organisations like the Clare Foundation who are focused on supporting that good research to affect good change in New Zealand society. Sue mentioned my parliamentary career. It's no secret, I think, that from the time I entered in 1999, my core focus was children and care. And they were largely in care as a result of violence in the home, whether it's physical violence or sexual violence, and often a combination of the two. And that is just the evidence of the problem. The real issue, if you want to resolve that problem, is you have to go to the heart of it, which is family violence. And you have to prevent children ending up in care. And in 2014, Amy Adams and I set up an all-of-government a trial attempt to get everyone sitting around the table and addressing the issue together. And then the 2017 Labor Greens government continued on that work, and it continues today, as difficult as it is. But the actual fact is it needs all of Parliament sitting around the table, accepting and understanding the complexity of the issues and wanting to work together to resolve them. It can be done. And I think, Jan, it was 2016, the women parliamentarians got together and passed an extraordinary piece of legislation that was never on the books, never in anyone's agenda, and that was to abolish or to make illegal female genital mutilation. So it can be done and it needs to be done. Because, as Sue said, nearly 1 in 4 New Zealand adults report having experienced sexual violence. And there's about 82,000 victims every year. That's an enormous amount. And that doesn't take into account those hundreds of thousands of children of those victims and their other wider family members, and then the communities in which they live. And as I know from the work that I did, it passes into the next generation because those children grow up in environments where that violence is seen as normal, and so it continues. So I do want to also take the opportunity to acknowledge in this room here today are an enormous group of people and agencies who work with victims, survivors, offenders, their children, etc., etc. It is hard work, it is complex work. There's never enough money and there's never enough time. So we do want to acknowledge those of you who are working, who are doing the mahi currently. And many of you have given your time and energy to contribute to the report that we're releasing today. So thank you so much. If we want lasting change, and we must have it, we all need to work together, both government and civil society, and we need to work across Parliament. So the research team has already reached out. We had a good meeting with the women parliamentarians and I was just talking to one of them in the weekend who was asking where the report is. They are eagerly awaiting it, and we will go down, I'm sure, and present it to them again. And of course, let's not forget what next year is. It's election year, and all those current parliamentarians and aspiring parliamentarians are there, eager to hear of good evidence-based research and opportunities for change. So finally, because they only really gave me 5 minutes, I do want to acknowledge the team who wrote the report, the Helen Clark Foundation, and Murray's here, Chief Executive, and of course led by Sarah Bell, who will take you through the report in a minute. I think that the final result is really impressive. As I say, I had the opportunity to pop in and out of some of the early discussions. I was impressed always by the wide range of diverse thinking, the robust discussions, the ethical considerations that went into those initial debates. And then I think what they have produced is well evidenced, and they are reasonable recommendations. They're not going to scare the horses. This is not radical changes. This is sensible, evidence-based recommendations. In fact, many of them are already in operation in like-minded countries around the world and seeing some results. So I'm confident that everyone here in this room will get in behind the report, and we will work together to effect significant change to alleviate the misery and the tragedy of sexual violence in New Zealand. So that's it from me. I'm now going to ask Ruth if she would come up and say a few words. Kia ora tātou.
Got nothing to say anymore. No. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Ruth Money, tōku ingoa. Thank you for being here to acknowledge the launch of the Addressing Sexual Violence in New Zealand report, and for all of the mahi that has gone on behind the scenes to get us here today. Today does mark a really important moment. It's not just the launch of the report, but it's the continuation of a movement. As you are all aware, sexual violence is not a distant issue that happens somewhere else to someone else. It is woven through our communities, through our workplaces, and our families. And while the impacts are profound and lifelong, the true tragedy is that so much of it is preventable. When we address sexual violence, we are not just reacting to harm, we are reshaping the future we want for our communities. This report brings together evidence, lived experience, community voices, frontline expertise, and long-standing research. It builds on the countless hours of important mahi that survivors, advocates, whānau, educators, social workers, researchers, and support providers have all dedicated to ensuring survivors have access to justice, safety, dignity, and support that validates them rather than re-traumatizing them. The set of recommendations are urgently needed. Among them is the call to increase the jury threshold for sexual violence cases and ensure that survivors are not disproportionately failed by a system that was never designed with the realities of sexual violence in mind. When 90% of sexual violence cases never reach conviction, it is clear that change is not just desirable, it is both necessary and overdue. The report also calls for training and accreditation for the judiciary and lawyers, because survivors deserve to enter a courtroom where everyone, from counsel to bench, understands trauma, cultural safety, consent, and the dynamics of coercive control. Justice must not re-traumatise the very people seeking protection. It highlights the need for a positive consent law, one that makes it clear that sexual activity requires active, willing, enthusiastic agreement rather than silence or a lack of resistance. Consent should not be ambiguous, and neither should our legal framework. Education emerged as a strong theme within the report, emphasising specialist training for teachers, police, and frontline workers so that disclosure, support, and prevention are all handled with the skill and empathy that survivors deserve. It also highlights the critical need for public education, especially for rangatahi and young adults, about healthy relationships, respect, boundaries, consent. Violence begins long before the harm occurs. Sorry, violence prevention begins long before the harm occurs. When people understand what consent, support, and accountability look like, our communities become safer. This report and the recommendations are important and timely because when we talk about sexual violence, we are not discussing statistics. We are talking about people's lives. Survivors tell us that they don't just want justice. They want acknowledgement. They want safety. They want change, so no one else experiences what they have. But addressing sexual violence is the responsibility of us all. Parents, education, communities, police, frontline workers, lawmakers, and every person who is willing to say, we can do better. We must do better. Everyone deserves to feel and be safe. Everyone deserves to be heard. And everyone deserves the right to choose when, how, and with whom they share intimacy. So to every survivor who has ever shared their truth, thank you. To those who have chosen not to, we see you and honour you too. Your experiences are shaping a safer Aotearoa. To every support provider, advocate, researcher, and community leader, thank you for your dedication and your persistence in spaces that are often heavy, complex, and unseen. And to every person here today, watching today, thank you for showing that this mahi matters, that you believe in a future where sexual violence is no longer normalised, minimised, or hidden, and that the justice system's response is both appropriate and safe. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, Ruth. Thank you so much. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Sarah Bell, and I was project manager for this Addressing Sexual Violence project. That meant I had the honour of supporting our amazing research team as they carried out their mahi, and also of turning all of their incredible, very well-informed research into the report, which you'll find on your way out. There are some printed summary copies, not enough for everyone, unfortunately, but do take one if you'd like one. And the full report is now available on our website, and we'll send a link around after the event. I'd just like to very briefly echo the acknowledgements others have made to the wonderful Clare Foundation for your generous support of this project, to Anne for all of her support and guidance, which was very much not ignored throughout the process, to Ruth, thank you for being here today and your support of the project, and to Sue and Maikara, thank you for having us here with you today. And of course to the project team for all of your work and for bearing with me as I learned a huge amount about these issues over the last few months. And of course to Helen Clark and Murray and the Foundation for your support and for this amazing opportunity. I'm not going to go into depth about the nature of the problem of sexual violence. I feel like we've talked a lot about that already today, and I feel like everybody in this room and with us virtually knows very much how big and important this problem is. It's a really complex one, and in some ways it's a very old one. There's also already a huge amount of work underway to address it, and we want to acknowledge that work both by those who are with us today in person and online, and by many others who aren't. This project attempts to add to that work by addressing some areas in which New Zealand sexual violence laws and policies are falling behind international best practice, falling behind technological changes, and falling behind the way that society thinks about sexual norms. So I'm going to give a very brief summary of the recommendations. Please do look at the full report afterwards for more detail and more precision. And I know there's a mixed level of experience with these issues in the room, so I'll try and keep it accessible to non-experts like myself, but please, I want to acknowledge that some of you live and breathe this every day, so please bear with us. So I'll start with the sort of the biggest and most complex topic that we covered in the report, which is addressing our very low rates of reporting of sexual violence and the low rates of cases that make it through to trial and a verdict. So Emily and Chloe, who I'll introduce shortly when they're up here, took that project on and looked at why that underreporting is occurring, why those cases are not making through to trial and a verdict, and therefore why that sexual violence is not able to be properly addressed. And they came up with a number of recommendations to support people throughout that process to increase that reporting and reduce attrition as people move along the justice pathway. So those range from a wider range of reporting options to give people different ways of reporting, an online hub to deliver more comprehensive and accessible information to survivors, increasing support to survivors, complainants once they're in the justice process, improving police investigative practice to make sure that people aren't sort of hitting a first hurdle when they get to police, reducing pretrial delays, as Ruth mentioned, by use of specialist court scheduling lists, and also raising the penalty threshold for judge-alone trials. Reducing the significant secondary trauma that people experience when they get to trial. So people have said that the trial, and particularly cross-examination, can be just as traumatic as the initial assault itself. That's obviously, as Ruth says, not acceptable and not conducive to getting justice ultimately. So we've got recommendations there around specialist sexual violence courts, which have been piloted in Auckland and Whangarei, rolling those out more widely, rolling out the practices that are used in those courts more widely still, accreditation and training, as Ruth mentioned, so that the professionals involved in those trials are managing them carefully, and further research to look into how rape myths affect the decisions that juries and judges make, because we know that those myths are really prevalent in society. We also looked at alternative pathways to meet survivors' justice needs. We know that not all survivors want their perpetrators to go to jail, and we know that that can hold people back from reporting in the first place because they lose control then of the outcome. So the research shows that sexual violence can be very treatable, and we've recommended looking into the establishment of a sexual violence treatment court based on what's been done for drug and alcohol. And also expanding current funding for restorative justice and looking into the possibility of a parallel restorative justice process. We've also recommended more Māori-led research into how best to close the gap for Māori, given that they are at significantly greater risk of sexual violence, but underrepresented in solutions, and we acknowledge our own position as tangata tiriti in that respect. So that was a huge piece of work. Well done, Emily and Chloe. And Emily will be able to talk about it further shortly. The next part of the report looks at consent law reform, and there's been significant momentum towards reforming consent law internationally for some time, and in New Zealand over the last few years. I know we've got Liba here, hi Liba, who presented a petition 3 years ago to Parliament to update our consent law. We've brought the Foundation's voice to that, and Dr. Anna Hai's expertise into that conversation. So New Zealand's consent law currently follows a partial affirmative consent model, which means that although you can't assume consent just because the person doesn't protest or resist, there are some situations described as passivity plus X, where you might be able to assume consent even if the person doesn't say or do anything to communicate consent. Our report argues that's lagging behind comparable jurisdictions. Most Australian states, Canada, many US states have all moved to a full affirmative consent model. It's lagging behind the yes means yes model that is used in schools. It's even used by the police when they teach people about consent. And it's sort of how society is increasingly thinking about consent. And it's leaving people vulnerable. And we think that's an important gap to close. So we've made 3 relatively simple recommendations to update the Crimes Act, to adopt an affirmative consent model, and to introduce a positive definition of consent, which is currently not there, so that we say what consent is and not just what it isn't. None of those changes would change the burden of proof in a sexual violence trial, and they deliberately don't specify how people should communicate about consent. So we don't say what words people need to use and what that needs to look like, although we think it would be great if it was enthusiastic. It doesn't say enthusiastic, because we don't want to go too far down the path of dictating how people interact with each other. We do think it's really important to close that gap and make sure that consent can't be assumed. The third set of recommendations in the report looks at addressing the harm from deepfake image-based abuse. There's been a lot of media coverage about that this year, which is great. Good to see it getting more attention. So Chloe and Sophia looked at the way, or how easy it is to create a really realistic video or image using just someone's Facebook profile picture, for example, and depict them undertaking sexual acts that they have not undertaken, and they haven't consented potentially to the creation or sharing of those images. The research shows that the harm to victims from having those images circulating online can be just as severe as the harm from having a real image of you circulating online. But at the moment, those two things aren't treated the same way under law. So as with consent, a number of jurisdictions overseas are moving to specifically address the harm from deepfake abuse and specifically ban the non-consensual creation and sharing of those images. In New Zealand, MP Laura McClure introduced a members' bill earlier this year, which was recently pulled from the tin. That bill looks to close exactly the gap that we have identified, and we're hoping that it'll be passed next year as it moves through the process, with a small tweak to what's currently in the bill to make sure that it covers images that are created with consent and shared without consent. We also heard a lot, as we were talking about deepfakes specifically, about the fact that New Zealand's current online regulatory system doesn't adequately protect New Zealanders from online harm, and particularly young New Zealanders. So we haven't delved into detail in that in the report, but we have recommended that the government take another look at regulatory reform. There have been some initiatives underway over the last few years. We heard really consistently that fixing this one deepfakes issue was important, but so was addressing the wider system. The next part of the report that we looked at was the issue of so-called virginity testing. We use inverted quotes in the report, at least to start with, to indicate that although that's a term that's used, it's not a scientifically accurate term. So virginity testing is an invasive internal examination that is undertaken on usually young women in an attempt to establish whether they have had sex before. The UN has stated, and medical practitioners in New Zealand confirm that it is not scientifically valid. There is no exam that can tell whether someone has had sex before, and we know that virginity is a socially constructed idea. It's an idea that's very important to many people, but it can't be determined via a medical procedure. The procedure causes huge harm to the people who undergo it, and we know anecdotally that it's taking place in New Zealand. It's very difficult to get good data on it. But as with the example that Anne highlighted around female genital mutilation, we think that the fact that it is happening and the fact that the UN has called for its abolition is sufficient for us to take action. So we've got a number of recommendations around education for medical professionals and social workers, around support for community-led education efforts to help people understand what is and isn't scientifically valid, and ultimately for legislative change as well to ban the procedure. The last section of the report wasn't one we set out to include, which is around education, but the common theme throughout every conversation we had was you can make these changes, but what you've really got to do is support that with education. So education for young people through the curriculum, which is currently not sufficiently addressing issues of consent, online harm that people are exposed to. There are pretty confronting stats around the age at which people are encountering pornography and how much of their sex ed they're getting from that, and the lack of awareness of the other kinds of digital harms, including from AI, that are emerging, and also the importance of compulsory consent education in tertiary institutions as well. So we've pulled together a set of recommendations aimed at addressing harmful beliefs in society and upskilling people to better confront the issues they're facing. So that's the report. Sorry, that was a very quick rattle through it, but there's a huge amount of research that lies behind it. As I say, please do have a look at the summary of recommendations, look at the full report. The report's also supported by 4 even more detailed literature reviews, which are available on our website if you're interested in delving further into the research. At this point, I'm going to ask our research team to come up, and I'll introduce them, and then I'm going to pose a few questions to them, and then we'll open the floor very briefly for questions from the audience. Unfortunately, our online audience won't be able to ask questions, but I hope you find the conversation useful anyway. So first I will introduce our wonderful team, Dr. Emily Henderson, Dr. Anna Hai, Chloe Cashmore, and Sophia Hare. I indicated earlier, sorry, I think I forgot to say that Sophia had led the research on the virginity testing piece. So we're going to start with Emily. We talked about a lot of recommendations on underreporting and attrition. We described Emily's research as the behemoth because there was just so much content there. Emily, what's the most important thing we could do to tackle underreporting and attrition now?
Well, like any good woman, you asked me for one thing, I'm going to give you 3. I'm going to take the court piece first, because Ruth hit it on the head when she picked this out of her summary of Chloe and my work. It's education, it's accreditation. It's getting hold of the professionals from the police right through to the judges and the lawyers, and making sure we really do have specialisation in that room. Because I understand what the judges say about their independence, but the fact is, being able to opt in to research and understanding and education where you think you know what you know, but you actually don't, it's not good enough. The time has come. England's been doing it for years. We need to accredit our judges. And the good news there is that we have already trialled this with the sexual violence courts. Hand on my sleeve, I'm one of the architects of that, so I have a slight vested interest. It's not good enough, but it's a damn good start. And that is what I would say about all of the court reforms that we are recommending. They are actually all things that we in this room, and there are some of us here who have been doing this work, I've been doing this work for over 30 years. There are people in this room who are well over 40. So we know what good practice is. We have the laws to support it in terms of good practice in the courts and in the police. We just need to damn well do it and get the funding for it. So that's what number 1. Number 2 is, that's 10% of our victim survivors who are prepared to go to the criminal justice system. We automatically all of us tend to default to carceral feminism. I found out it's got a term, carceral feminism. This focus on the courts. We need to be looking at on-ramps, and I see Alison Moe is in the room, who is looking at, with Tika, a model for online reporting, which would enable survivors to take control of their narrative and not automatically end up down the police until they're ready. We need to look at the way the police handle it. But we also need to look at alternatives, because the fact is the court is never going to be the preferred option for many of our victim survivors and their whānau. And that's okay. What we need is that treatment and the restorative justice options. And again, we know this. What we need is the political will to bloody well do it. My third one is, we've already seen Ruth up here being the extraordinary advocate she is, and I want to tautoko. We've got also her predecessor, Dr. Kim McGregor in the room, who was doing the job before her. We have seen the incredible power of women like these to bring these issues forward and keep them in the spotlight. This project, as we are all the first to say, does not have a total grasp on everything we need to do. This was about getting fast and furious and what could we do now? But here's an idea we didn't come up with, but Kim did. We need to turn this woman and all of her predecessors into the first victims commissioner. Someone who actually has the mandate to hold the government to account in a much more, even more powerful way. Because that's what we're missing. We know what these ideas are. We've even got the legislation and we've got the policy. But I'm damned if I want to be sitting here in 20 years listening to some younger researcher saying the same stuff over again. Let's get ourselves a victims commissioner.
Kia ora. Thank you, Emily. Well done. That was a very concise 3. Anna, affirmative consent is widely taught across the motu in schools and universities. Why is the law lagging behind here? And what would the implications of reform be, particularly for young people?
Kia ora, Sarah. I think the reason our law is lagging behind is, firstly, we haven't updated the substantive law of consent for 20 years now. And in that time, there have been some really significant social changes. We can point to things like the Me Too movement. We can see a greater willingness to have discussion and openness around consent and coercion and communication and mutuality. And alongside that, we've seen in those last few decades the rise of this ideal of yes means yes. Now, that's not a legal standard. It's a slogan, but it's a really useful one. It's gained a lot of traction, and that's a significant shift from no means no. Under that traditional no means no model, the onus is very clearly on the person who's objecting to communicate non-consent, which means there's a right to assume until you are able to see that communication. And it's at odds with what we know about tonic immobility, the freeze response to being sexually assaulted. It's also at odds with, I think, the values that we want our system to espouse. Why are we privileging a right to assume over a duty to communicate? I don't think it is onerous to ask people to communicate when they want to be engaging in sexual activity. And we see that in, as you said, the way that our students and young people are being taught. All of the 8 universities talk about affirmative consent. The police talk about it on their website. Te Whatu Ora talks about it, but the law's lagging behind. I think the law change could be really significant. It's not radical. I really want to emphasize that. We're already most of the way there. This is not a particularly huge change, but I think it's significant. The law already says you cannot assume someone is consenting based solely on the fact that they didn't say no. But there is still accommodation in our legal system in some circumstances to assume in the absence of communication. So we're talking about an important but not particularly radical change to simply specify that for there to be consent, there must have been communication. Now, it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't fix everything. People will disagree about whether this action or these words indicated consent. There's still those broader structures of coercion that implicate free agreement and free will. Okay, so no one's suggesting this is a magic fix, but it is important. It's not particularly radical, and it's happening in other jurisdictions. It's been in place for decades in Canada. in some Australian states and territories. So we're arguing that it should happen here as well. I think it could have a trickle-down effect in terms of education. I think that our law should match with this yes means yes ideal. I think that it could have make a difference in some criminal justice contexts. It won't be okay to say, well, she didn't say no, so I thought she was consenting. That will be ruled out as an available argument, right? It doesn't change the burden of proof. It's really important to emphasize that, but it might change what the prosecutor can rely on in terms of establishing non-consent and a lack of a belief in consent. And importantly, it brings the law into alignment with the types of sexual ethics that we want to see, an ethic of sexuality that emphasizes mutuality, respect, communication, rather than let's just make some assumptions here. The stakes are too high to allow people to do that.
Kia ora. Thank you, Anna. Chloe, moving on to deepfakes in online culture. The report shows that deepfake abuse emerges from misogynistic digital subcultures and normalized harm. Why are we reaching for criminal law when the problem is fundamentally cultural?
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Sarah. The research is clear. Deepfake sexual abuse stems from misogynistic digital subcultures, platforms that gamify degradation and normalized harm denial. So why criminal law? Well, primarily two reasons. One, right now we have a critical gap in our law. Both the Crimes Act and the Harmful Digital Communications Act assume in their definitions that intimate images are recorded. So that's someone with a camera capturing a real person in a real place. So deepfakes don't fit. The Harmful Digital Communications Act does have an alternate pathway that deepfakes could apply to, but it sets a much higher threshold. It requires both that victims prove that there was an intent to cause harm and that actual harm occurred. So we're supporting the Deepfake Digital Harm and Exploitation Bill because it levels that playing field. It goes in, as Sarah was saying, and it updates the definitions in both the Crimes Act and the Harmful Digital Communications Act so that deepfakes are included and can be prosecuted more easily. This isn't because we believe it's going to stop all deepfake abuse. It won't. But victims do deserve legal protections that actually work. The second reason is that the absence of a law here is actively reinforcing harm denial. When we fail to criminalize something that causes serious harm, we're sending a message, and that message is ugly. This doesn't matter enough. So law can't single-handedly shift culture, but I think that it can validate victims' experiences and signal that deepfake sexual abuse is serious. And I think this is crucial. If we stop at criminal law, we will have failed. By the time someone's creating a deepfake, the cultural conditions are already set. That's why our recommendations aren't just pass the bill and we're done. They're our pillared approach. We'd like to see educational reform to prevent harm before it occurs. This legislative reform to close the gap. And we're calling for the government to revisit looking at regulatory reform, learning from international examples like Australia and the UK to address the conditions that are enabling it currently. So yeah, all three working together.
Thank you, Chloe. And Sophia, just a tiny question for you at the end. This is an enormous report. We have made a lot of recommendations. What's the key takeaway that you would want policymakers to have when they're looking at this report?
So I'll probably reinforce a bit of what we've already heard today. But first, I want to remind policymakers that under the current settings, 1 in 3 of the girls and women in their lives will have or will one day experience sexual violence. And that's a horrific statistic. But I also want them to know that there are steps that they can take so that those future generations don't have to share that experience with us. And what that looks like and what our conversations have highlighted throughout this project is that we need multiple levels of intervention, and we've heard a bit about that already. So that's from supporting survivors all the way to preventing perpetration in the first place. Up top, we've got those bigger preventative pieces, the online regulation, understanding more about what's driving perpetration and the factors that are leading to that behaviour. And then there's that big education piece that needs to occur at multiple levels. So those national campaigns targeted within certain groups. We need consistently delivered education throughout the curriculum. But then there's these smaller opportunities that are essentially low-hanging fruit. And the gap within the HDCA is a really good example of that. And I think the definition of consent is as well. These opportunities or these low-hanging fruit, they're not going to prevent sexual violence, but they're going to provide these additional layers of protection, this consistency, these additional pathways to justice that that survivors urgently need right now. Yeah, so essentially, it can't be this or that. It needs to be this and that. We need those really robust systems level interventions, but then we also need to be taking these opportunities right now to implement those additional layers of protection and those additional pathways to justice.
Hello, Sophia. Thank you all, amazing team. We've got time for a couple of questions from the audience and just a couple so that we finish on time. I'm going to ask Amy to pass the mic to anyone who'd like to ask a question to any of our panelists.
Kia ora. Thank you for this very important kōrero, and of course I knock over my glass. I'm Stella. All of you have touched on bureaucratic delays and procedural barriers, which I really think is systemic violence that perpetuates the resistance to change in our institutions. Can you expand on whether the report or how the report addresses that systemic violence, especially for victims and survivors who may have multiple marginalized identities?
Sarah said that my report was the behemoth, which means that that is a behemoth of a question, and you're absolutely spot on. It is re-traumatizing. In fact, Sarah mentioned cross-examination, but delay is the #1 thing that victims and survivors within the criminal justice system talk about as a source of trauma. And of course it is. You want to talk about systemic stuff-ups. The first time that New Zealand noticed that cases involving criminal trials involving child sex abuse were lagging behind everything else was about 88. And it was about 88, 89 that the then chief judge of the district court issued the first prioritized child sex cases directive. Delays then were 8 months. I would kill for delays of 8 months. We're now sitting 2 to 3 to 4 years in some cases. It is something that just gets ignored. So in terms of how we do it, this is where I think that the accreditation, the specialization and the focus by the courts on these issues is really crucial. Because when we set up the sexual violence court, only little, right? And mainly it was around judicial training to just get them to use what was already there. When we set that up, the Chief Judge Doog, wonderful woman, she gave us, she had no budget from the ministry, I'd like to point out, but she looked at her own budget and she took a specialist registrar and she put a senior registrar in each of the 2 pilot courts, and that specialist registrar working with a specialist judge reduced delays in half in a year and a half. From 2 years to 1 year. It was about focus, understanding of the importance, and the will to do it. Now, the other thing that Ruth and Sarah have picked out is the increased use of judge-alone trials. We all know that increases, a judge-alone trial is a short trial. So I'm still wary, until we accredit the judges and the lawyers, I'm still wary as to whether the attitudes are going to, attitudes and the practice are going to shift enough to make them be sufficiently different from juries. I believe in the judges that I worked with on the sexual violence court. They were extraordinary, and they had educated themselves and changed their practice. But at the very least, we could actually go along. I'm dressed in blue today. Did I mention I used to be a Labour MP? I'm dressed in blue today. Purposely, because actually I think Paul Goldsmith might be onto something when he said we need to increase the threshold for jury trials so more low-level crime are just judge alone, because that frees so much time in the system while we work on getting our judges to the point where they actually have more specialisation in this. There's a fantastic saying, I saw it on the back of a truck. I was stopped at the lights in whangare. Whangare, the tail that wags the fish. And it goes, whakahau na whakaro, whakahau te ao. Change your thinking, change the world. That's how we do it. We know what we're doing. We just need to get them to know it.
Got it. All right, one more question.
I'm going to say this on behalf of my team. We in this room, we are how this gets done. This project is about reaching across the divide. We've already talked about Laura McClure's deepfake bill. And I've already said I am dyed in the wool red under these clothes. But I look good in blue. It is about the cross-party working that Anne Tolley talked about. It is about each of us writing to our MP again and again and again and asking to see them and saying, this matters to me, because I can tell you as an ex-MP, pester power works. Okay, it really, really works. We are more susceptible than a parent standing in a shopping line on a Friday afternoon with toddlers. So keep the pressure up. But then if we can get that cross-party enthusiasm, and I really think it is there, we can shift a huge amount, because a lot of this is about getting the right messages in justice and courts ministry and women's ministry to actually put the pressure on practitioners. But then, I'm going to say it again, we have to put the resources into the professionals out there. We have to get the education. We have to give the police the budget to actually train. And I would say 2 words to you if anyone's interested in the police: Operation Soteria in the UK, where they're actually working teams of people like you guys and like us, practitioners and academics, actually working with frontline police to change attitudes. I've seen it work. I watched a bunch of crusty, deeply beloved, crusty white men become incredible advocates for women and children in criminal trials because they understood the problem. So it is possible. We can change this, but it takes pressure from all of us. So pick up your phones, pick up your fingers, email your MP and put the pressure on. Tell them that this is an issue you will be voting on, because that matters.
Of these, is there an organisation or a cross group that is taking each of these recommendations and putting a strategy in action?
We are.
What's it called?
It's called the Helen Clark Foundation Addressing Sexual Violence, because we are actively trying to, this is the reason that we are here today, is to try and create that pressure and create that momentum. The reason, as Anne said, we were down speaking cross-party is because of that. In fact, I think this is the moment when I should bring Anne up. The reason that we have, you know, Dr. Kim McGregor understands this with her idea about the Victims Commissioner. That's why I love that idea, because it is about keeping the constant pressure on. And the beauty of a Victims Commissioner is it's actually quite cheap, and the politicians will like that one. So sign up to that one as well. You know, it is a systemic, there is no silver bullet. It is about pester power. It is about making it clear to your politicians that this matters to us. And it's about supporting each other to do it. But yeah, that's why we're doing this. And I would just like to shout out to Vanushi Walters, who is an MP now in Parliament and who was the chair of the Justice Select Committee when I did my accidental 3 years in power. And, you know, this is her brainchild to try and bring together a roadmap for achievable change to put cross-party, because she knew as a parliamentarian that it was possible. And I know as an ex-practitioner.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you for the wonderful question. It's what we're all here for, right? Is to create change. So thank you for engaging on how we can do that. I'm going to hand over to Maikara now to close for us, and we'll have some time for kai and more kōrero afterwards.
Thank you. A tuatahi, ka tukutaku mihi ki a koutou, ki ngā kai kōrero, I hara mai, I mau mai, I kawe mai o koutou pūkenga, kei wainganui tēnei rōpū. Kia ko tēnei kōrero, he tika te kōrero. Good research, awesome results from good research. Nō reira, he mihi nui ki a koutou, ki a tātou katoa. Ko tētahi kōrero kia piri tahi. Now this kōrero kia piritahi was given by Te Atarangi Kahu to our whānau on Waiheke Island. Kia piritahi is in reference to the people on the island, and it didn't matter who you were or where you were from, but it was also inclusive of Māori. Now that name was given to our whare tūpuna, to our whare whakairo. And as I said at the very beginning, that's what I kept thinking of. Kia piritahi ai tātou. And even at the end, you also rounded it up. So I thought, yes, it's those kōrero. The thing is, from Te Atarangi Kahu, te kuia, she was very wise. She observed, she listened. She was a very beautiful kuia, and a kuia for Māoridom. And the other thing also I'd like to mention is that both kia koutou, kia mātou, ko tahi tātou, they're coming together. We also have solutions. We also, as te ao Māori, te ao Māori, have ways of doing things. Coming together as one will help gain a better future for all of us, because the intention and the outcome is the same. We all want that for everyone. Nō reira, he mihi nui ki a koutou, I kawe ngā pukenga, brought those skills towards us. We've heard and we thank you, and I thank you. Kia tātou katoa. So, ka nui te mihi, ka inoi tātou. I tuku tēnei wā ki a koe ai o matua kore. Mō tō whakaaro nui, mō ngā kupu Manaaki, Tiaki, Humarie, Rangimarie, Awhi, Tautoko, Kaha, Aroha. Tuku tēnei wā, I raro te mare o te tuanui I o matua kore. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, Mauri ora, everyone. Thank you.